On average, Canadians pay for about 8 subscriptions. And we're always trying to whittle them down. Like Janice Grayowski.
I've had Apple, I've had Crave, at my peak, I probably had a dozen, and now I'm probably down to about 6.
Signing up for those was easy. Canceling, on the other hand. Hi, I'm Paul Havershood. Welcome to The Cost of Living. Trying to get out of some subscriptions can feel like Andy Dufresne escaping from Shawshank. It ain't easy. The US wants to change that. So could that make a difference here? Also today, as you may be aware, there was a big election in the States. The winner is talking about across-the-board tariffs. That includes their biggest trading partner, us. And maybe even our biggest export, oil. Up first, private equity firms are buying more businesses than ever. But what exactly is private equity? And why do some of these deals make people go, uh-oh? Gail McClellan started working at Sears in 1984. When she thinks about the good times, she remembers stuff like opening a big new furniture store in Calgary.
The grand opening, it was just phenomenal. Like, they brought in a trainer from the States and trained us for 2 weeks on selling, and then had the grand opening, and it was first class all the way. Unbelievable.
At the store launch, Sears brought in Sharon Case, a daytime soap star. This was the late 90s.
A lot of people watched Young and the Restless back then, and it just brought more people into the store. And yeah, that was quite an experience. I mean, we were riding high. It was just like top of the line furniture, top of the line everything. Everything was first class.
The good times didn't last. Like other department stores, Sears was squeezed by online shopping, big box retailers. That's when private equity stepped in. Private equity, in the last 15 years, has been on a buying spree. It's bought Toys R Us, Rexall, The Bay, WestJet. The idea behind private equity is pretty simple. A PE firm gets money from investors, uses it to buy companies, it gives those companies a makeover, then sells them. That's the happy PG version. But it doesn't always go like that. When Wall Street private equity financier Eddie Lampert bought Sears, he ran it lean and mean. He let stores get run down, cut back on inventory and staff.
I would have to go out to the floor and track down shipments or whatever, and the people would stop me. Can I get some help? Can I get some help? And yeah, there was no staff on the floor to help. They weren't putting money back into the company to hire more people or do anything. And yeah, it was brutal.
Another thing that happened?
He started selling off all our assets. He sold everything. Like, we owned the Sears downtown. They sold that building. We owned the building in Sears in Vancouver. They sold the building, and he got, that's how he made his money. He disposed of all our assets, bit by bit by bit.
Gail's 3 decades at Sears ended in 2018, when it declared bankruptcy. Private equity is now quietly everywhere. It's bought big companies, Tim Hortons, Postmedia, and small ones, dentists, long-term care homes, bowling alleys. Not every private equity deal winds up like Sears. It doesn't end in disaster, but
the chances of disaster meaningfully increase when a private equity firm is involved. So by one measure, bankruptcies at companies are 10 times as likely when they're bought by private equity firms as when they remain independent.
Brendan Ballou is the author of Plunder, Private Equity's Plan to Pillage America. And yeah, he has big worries about private equity, or at least some of it. Private equity can be broken into 3 camps: venture capitalists, growth investors, and buyout firms. Private equity gets its bad reputation from the buyout firms. They scour the world looking for companies with hidden value and then unlock it for themselves. Like one move from the private equity playbook, something Eddie Lampert did at Sears, buy a company for its real estate, then sell the land.
So a private equity firm will require a business to sell its underlying assets, its real estate, its factories, and so forth, and then lease it back to itself. That generates a quick hit of cash that the private equity firm gets, but as a result, the business now no longer has assets that it used to be able to rely on.
Look at Red Lobster, the seafood chain. It declared bankruptcy earlier this year. The headlines blame that on its endless shrimp special. That didn't help, but endless shrimp didn't really kill Red Lobster. It was private equity doing a sale and leaseback. Red Lobster was around for 50 years. Owning its buildings helped it thrive in good years and survive in bad ones.
Real estate is really valuable for any company, but it's especially valuable for somebody in retail or food services or so forth, both because it keeps your monthly costs down, but also you have an asset that you can borrow against in bad times. And so suddenly when a business is shorn of those assets, it makes it a much more fragile, much more brittle endeavor for when something goes wrong.
If someone calls Sears or the Bay a real estate play, they mean the land is what matters and not, staffing checkout counters. But sale and leasebacks are only one way private equity can make life tough for an otherwise profitable business. When it buys a company, it does it with borrowed money. Brendan Ballou says the really good part, at least for private equity, it can then put those debt payments back on the company it just bought.
It's a little bit like getting to use somebody else's credit card, but it adds further instability to the businesses that are getting bought because now they have to spend all that money paying down the debt and servicing it.
Private equity has been around a long time, but it's been supercharged by interest rates falling to almost zero after the 2008 financial crisis. That let it take a little bit of money and borrow a whole bunch of money. And it did, and bought all kinds of businesses. The industry is now worth more than $10 trillion.
That is bigger than the market cap of Meta, Google, Tesla, and the 5 top companies combined. This is a behemoth of an industry.
Rachel Wasserman is a former mergers and acquisitions lawyer who worked on private equity deals. One kind of transaction she thinks is flying too far under the radar: the roll-up. This is when PE buys a bunch of small businesses, then operates them together.
So roll-ups are everywhere, and they're going after everything they can. Take multiple businesses, put them together, harmonize the administration, and you've got a more efficient business. That makes total sense.
Private equity loves economies of scale and businesses with steady cash flow. If a dentist is looking to sell their practice, private equity will pay top dollar. So the dentist gets a windfall. As for patients,
your dentist used to be a small business. The one dentist or, 2 dentists owned a practice. They would make decisions about your care and, they would run the business. But with roll-ups, what's happening is your dentist may still be your dentist. But instead of your dentist owning the practice, your dentist is an employee of the practice and is accountable to the investor to deliver certain levels of profits.
Whether it's a dentist or an airline, private equity ownership can put pressure on a business. And nice stuff for customers can take a back seat to making more money. Rachel says small businesses no longer being small can also come with bigger consequences.
If we roll up all of our vet clinics and they become, corporate behemoths, what's to happen to a little kid today that wants to go and become a vet? By the time they graduate from veterinary school, their only choice will be to be an employee. They will have very little upward mobility because the chance of ownership is slim to none. They don't have the opportunity to get a job in an independent clinic and then buy out the former owner.
more roll-ups can lead to less competition. And if a handful of big companies own a bunch of vet clinics, what's left to keep prices in check? Where's the incentive to innovate? For the economy, Rachel sees these as the big picture worries of more private equity. What she doesn't see is much being done to keep it in check.
There is not a single law that has been enacted to regulate this industry. And our corporate laws, our markets, our securities laws have not adapted to the financialization of the private market. And so we're really working with an antiquated regime for a very modern day problem.
Just to be clear, private equity takeovers don't always end in disaster. But they do come with more layoffs, bankruptcies, general plundering. And private equity has come on fast. Gail McClellan, who worked at Sears for 3 decades, had a front row seat to what can happen.
I love Sears, I did. And everybody loved the Christmas catalog. I mean, that was a big thing. You waited for that Christmas catalog to come out.
The first Sears catalog came out in 1888. When the company filed for bankruptcy, more than 100 years later, it wasn't all private equity's fault, but it didn't help. On your radio and by podcast, this is The Cost of Living. I'm Paul Haberstrood. You know what we do a lot of as Canadians? We sign up for subscriptions, streaming channels, that free trial for a meal kit. But once you're in, it can be hard to get out. And every month, you keep getting dinged. In the US, regulators just told companies, hey, no more funny business. So could that make canceling stuff here any easier?
Janice Grayowski has signed up for a lot of subscriptions.
I've had Apple, I've had Crave. At my peak, I probably had a dozen, and now I'm...
Earlier this year, though, she decided to cut back, starting with her newspaper.
I just wasn't reading it, right? Like, I read a lot of news, and there's so many different sources these days.
But she couldn't cancel it online. She had to call a 1-800 number and talk to a sales rep.
And their first response was, well, we'll give you a deal. You know, it's 50% off now. And I go, well, no, thank you. And they go, oh, well, we'll give it to you even cheaper. And then it was like, no, I'm not reading it.
Signing up for a subscription? Easy peasy. Canceling one? Not so much.
This is a frustration that almost everybody has at one time or another.
James Combe is with the Federal Trade Commission, or FTC. It just introduced a new rule in the U.S. called Click to Cancel. It makes 2 big changes that are good for consumers. First, American companies will have to be more transparent about negative billing. That's when your free trial automatically turns into a paid subscription. And maybe more importantly,
You have to provide a method of cancellation that is as simple as it was to sign up and in the same media that one signed up in. If you signed up on the internet, you have to be able to cancel on the internet. If you sign up by phone, you have to be able to cancel by phone.
companies that don't do this could face big fines. And here's the good news. It might make things easier for Canadians.
Absolutely. Anybody who's selling in the United States, no matter whom they're selling to, is covered by this rule. So if you are selling from the United States or into the United States, you're covered by the rule.
So if a company's customers are mostly south of the border, it will probably just play by the U.S. rules. But what about getting our own click-to-cancel rule? John Lawford is with the Public Interest Advocacy Center. He says, that might be tricky. Consumer protection laws in Canada are scattered between the feds and the provinces, and they don't have the same mandate as the FTC Act.
Basically, Section 5 of that act says that business has to be done in a fair way in the U.S. We don't have that in Canada. You can do unfair business here. I know that businesses would take issue with that, but it's true.
Canada's Competition Bureau can crack down on false or misleading advertising, but subscriptions that are hard to cancel may not meet that bar.
So unless there's a very particular regulator or law that's covering their sector, these kinds of practices are just, unless they rise to an unconscionable business practice or otherwise violate the general civil law, it's allowed.
Now, that doesn't mean that Canadian companies couldn't just make it easier to cancel subscriptions, even without being forced to.
I'm hoping that this will become the way of doing business online, and they will just start to copy this in other jurisdictions, whether there's a rule for it or not.
John Lawford says we can dare to dream.
But it's no guarantee that your favorite website will all of a sudden start having an easy unsubscribe mechanism.
Okay, so maybe just think twice before signing up for that free trial. For the cost of living, I'm Jennifer Keane.
This is The Cost of Living. I'm Paul Havershood. Well, if we know one thing, Donald Trump winning the U.S. election will have all kinds of consequences for Canada's economy. A lot of them, maybe not great. Like, he's talking about a 10% tariff on all U.S. imports. That would be a doozy for Canada, especially if it includes oil, because that is by far our biggest export. But wait, that's not all for Canada's oil patch. The feds just released details on a proposed emissions cap. It wants them down by a third by the end of the decade. So on one side, you've got pro-oil Trump. He's all drill, baby, drill. And on the other, Canada is trying to cut emissions. How does this all fit together for Canadian oil and the economy? Rory Johnston is an oil analyst, and he writes the newsletter Commodity Context. Hi, Rory.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Well, thanks for being here, Rory. So, from the oil industry's perspective, the takeaway from Trump winning seems to be that it's a good thing. If we just look at oil prices, is that your read on things?
So if we just look at oil prices right now, they are effectively flat. There hasn't really been a consensus that's emerged as to whether or not Trump's victory is a net bullish or bearish development for the oil market writ large. But part of the inherent challenge of assessing and analyzing kind of potential policy risks from an incoming Trump presidency is that he has said a lot of things on the campaign trail, many of which are effectively mutually exclusive and some of which are quite extreme. And it's really, really difficult to kind of get a firm grounding on what are core priorities for him in governance and how those things will change once people from those various industries get into the room with Trump and his advisors and begin their lobbying process. Because again, a lot of these at their face could be quite destabilizing to various trade agreements.
Well, what about something like Keystone XL? We know Joe Biden killed Keystone on his first day in office. Could Trump potentially revive it?
The zombie pipeline, we can effectively call it at this stage because it simply never dies. Keystone XL, just very brief background, was canceled or pulled back under the Obama administration, then was resurrected in Trump's first term, and then was canceled once again under the Biden administration. It would not surprise me if Trump kind of came in and said, well, we're going to get Keystone built. I think that's a very symbolic thing. I think more so than the importance of the pipeline itself, it has become kind of a center symbol for both sides of the debate, as to whether or not you're in support of the industry or not. And I would think that, even if Trump comes in and says, we're going to build it again, you need a private company on the other side of this to actually say, okay, we're going to build it. In this case, the proponent and the kind of operator of the pipeline, TC Energy, really doesn't seem that interested in building this pipeline anymore. So even if it was approved, it seems unlikely that any private actor is going to go forward and kind of put that risk out there.
What about just the outlook for the industry? We know a lot has changed in the last 4 years. Canada now has the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Does Canada's oil patch still need Keystone?
I would say yes, but not immediately. And I think the challenge is that right now, Canada, as you noted, we just got the Trans Mountain Expansion pipeline up and running. This is the largest kind of surplus of pipeline capacity, or let's call it egress headroom, that we've had in more than a decade. In the entirety of my time covering the industry, we've always essentially been right on the razor's edge of overrunning pipeline capacity and egress if we include rail and everything else as well. So right now we are in a good position, but now the question is what's next? And there really aren't any other pipelines in the works. If you will, the pipeline of pipelines is empty. So all we have left is either kind of debottlenecking and improved efficiencies on our existing pipelines, which can only get us so far. So if you assume that Canadian production growth will continue to rise, which I do and the industry does, then we're going to need a new pipeline pretty soon, possibly as early as late 2026, early 2027. And it's even if Trump approved Keystone today, or the first day in office, it's going to take longer than that to get that pipeline up and running. So by the time this could even be conceivably available to the market, yes, I think it would be in demand.
I mean, that is a pretty big assumption, though. I think some people are probably listening and saying, whoa, can you back up? Canadian oil production is going to rise enough that we're going to need another pipeline that's carrying, 500,000, 1 million extra barrels a day. I mean, is the production outlook for Canada really sort of on that trajectory?
I think it would surprise a lot of people to know that right now, Canada is one of the largest sources of global supply growth in the world. After a period of kind of softening and kind of trading sideways through COVID and through this pipeline constraint period, now that we have these kind of wide open pipes and we have differentials that are currently around $12 a barrel for WCS, a very healthy price for that type of crude, we're seeing producers in Alberta really ramp up production. And in that kind of environment, you're going to grow. A friend of mine who is a driller and out west has basically told me, he's like, give us a pipeline and we'll fill it.
Well, there's also trade risk now on the table that we really haven't seen before. Trump is talking about this blanket global tariff of 10 to 20% on all U.S. imports. What might that mean for the Canadian oil industry?
Yeah, so I think it is a very, very low likelihood that you do see these tariffs applied to Canadian oil. But I think it's important for us to understand the risks. So I want to kind of break it down that the basic kind of simplest understanding of the relationship between Canada and the United States is Canada exports oil to the U.S. Midwest around, Illinois and kind of through that region. And then they refine it, turn it into gasoline or diesel and sell it into those various areas. So there are three places that incidence or the kind of weight of that tariff could fall. It could fall on refinery margins. So your crude costs more, the thing you're selling stays the same. So then you make less profit per barrel. It could end up on the U.S. motorist side. So pump prices in the United States could rise by 20%. Or it could get pushed, at least some of it get pushed back up the pipeline towards Canada and towards Alberta in terms of value erosion on that barrel. And I think the reason that the especially challenging thing for Canada here is that if we had complete optionality, if we had no lock-in to that market, then the majority of that incidence of the tariff would have to fall on the U.S. side of the border. It would have to fall on either refinery margins or U.S. pump prices. The thing that I think it creates more vulnerability for Canada, relative to the alternative scenario where we had kind of complete free access to global markets, is that U.S. refineries actually have more of the market power. So that if their margins start to weaken, they can push some of that pain back up towards us. So I won't go as far as to say that all of it will fall on Canada, but I think the relative dynamic of our trade relationship makes us more vulnerable than others to feeling some of that pain.
Well, you can hear some oil and gas execs right now thinking, hey, I thought a pro-oil White House was going to be good for us, and now maybe thinking, whoa, maybe let's look closer at this. Rory, the other thing that just happened to oil, the feds released details on an emissions cap. Can you just give us like a quick 30-second explanation of what that is?
Yeah, so I think The context here is that obviously Canada has agreed to a whole bunch of different climate targets in order to reduce its GHG emissions as part of these global treaties. Oil and gas is the largest single emitting sector in Canada, and generally the overall level of those emissions have risen. And then what this cap does is it essentially says between now and 2032, you need to reduce the amount of emissions from the sector overall, and you can't produce more than that. All else equal, it probably means less oil production from Alberta. This is a cap that's really going to be taking effect over the next 8 years, and we're likely going to have a federal election next year. So it's really an open question as to whether or not this will even hit legislation before we get to the stage of it actually kind of impacting industry policy.
And then finally, Rory, so if you look at just the last week, you've got Trump's win, you've got the emissions cap, net positive or negative week for Canada's oil industry?
So hard. I think, net, I would say, and I think this is probably, as you'd see reflected in market pricing, pretty flat, honestly. I think at this stage, it's so hard to tell how much of it will ever actually make it to the poll. I think that's a similarity in some ways between some of the things we're talking about with the Trump win and the new kind of oil and gas emissions cap, is there are big open questions about what this will actually look like when it comes to actual regulation and law. Even if we've heard kind of, musings or kind of like the shape of what the debate will look like, we have no idea what it's going to look like at the end.
Well, Rory Johnston, one thing we know for sure, we live in a world of uncertainty, and we had more of it in this past week. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Rory Johnston is an oil analyst, and he writes the newsletter, Commodity Context. That's all for this week. The Cost of Living is based in Calgary. The show is produced by Daniel Nerman, Ellis Cho, and Jennifer Keane, with help from Caroline, the fighting T-Rex Ferris. I'm Paul Habersrud. Thanks for listening.